And so I would say Homo naledi and Homo floresiensis are both human. Both suffered from a form of degeneration and pathology. A problem I have with the critics in Jackson Rowe, you can speak to this.
Okay.
A problem that I have with the critics when it comes to the hominin fossil record, and at least the specific model I hold to in explaining their anomalous and atypical features. And I'm not saying you're guilty of this, but I find a lot of critics, they get confused. They think that I am saying, or other creationists like Chris Roop are saying, oh, every single Homo naledi specimen had arthritis, or every single Neanderthal had arthritis, or hypothyroidism, or some kind of disease, right? That's not what we're saying. We're saying that the results of inbreeding, the results of existing in small populations, the effects of environment and epigenetics has resulted in these features, these atypical features, having drifted to fixation, where everybody in that population, let's say Homo naledi, okay, everybody in that population now has those traits: small body size, small brain size, curved fingers, for example. So those atypical features have drifted to fixation where they're the norm. Like Hobbit, for example, there's strong evidence there of founder effects, intense founder effects, where all the descendants of the originals now have those features. So it's not like, well, this population's all coincidentally suffering from this disease or this pathology or arthritis, right? No, it's that founder effects, inbreeding, especially in small populations, is very real. And most certainly after several generations of that inbreeding in a small population, you are going to have fixation. You are going to have evidence of inbreeding. And that evidence is negative. Jackson, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure, I don't disagree that Homo floresiensis probably had some founder effects, being bound to a single island, basically, or as far as we know. But I think the standard idea is that it's descended from Homo erectus, not like Homo sapiens. But I know you think that's also a human, right?
You don't know nothing, Jack. No, I'm just kidding. Erectus, I would argue, is a pathological form of Homo sapiens, a degenerate form of Homo sapiens. They existed in small tribes. They existed in between 50 and 100 individuals. And so in those circumstances, especially the harsh environment that they existed in, all of these different hominins, what that means is after a few generations, you're basically guaranteed to have evidence of inbreeding. And so erectus, which is a more degenerate form of Homo sapiens, gets a small group of erectus basically gets stuck on this island of Flores. And then that group suffers from insular dwarfism in many ways, and reductive evolution. And so I think Homo floresiensis is a more degenerate form of erectus. So I do agree that floresiensis, the precursor, is probably erectus, but I would also look to erectus as being human. Does that make sense, Jackson?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. But I mean, some people do go the route that they say it was all pathological, like Pseudonym said, that it was whatever, they chewed a lot. That's why their brow ridge is really big, stuff like that, the Neanderthals. But
the problem is
that's not your opinion. But
the problem I have with creationists that just say, well, name your hominin. Their atypical features is because of, arthritis or this disease. Well, you have to look at the babies. You have to look at the children. Do they have those same features? Naledi, for example, do the babies and the teenagers, do they also have the curved fingers? Do they have the same atypical features as the adults? Well, if that's the case, that means these features are fixed in the population. If it was just arthritis, you'd expect, the babies and then the teenagers and the adults to differentiate basically in those atypical features. Does that make sense? You'd expect your adult Neanderthal, let's say, to have those atypical features because over time they developed them, but not the children. right?
Right, but here's something you might be able to answer. With all the Neanderthal specimens we found, they all basically have the same skeletal features. Don't you think with inbreeding there would be one or two outliers that wouldn't have so many of the same features?
Well, that's my point, is the only reason an entire group like Neanderthal, I don't really like looking to Neanderthal because I think a lot of the features associated with Neanderthal are due to environment. Environment can dictate phenotype. Therefore, I believe a lot of the features associated with Neanderthal, like especially the robustness of Neanderthal, are eco-glacial adaptations. So yes, they were highly inbred. The genomic data says that Neanderthals were 40% less fit than modern humans.
Sure.
They had massive runs of homozygosity, where you look at these stretches of DNA and they have identical letters saying that they basically intermarried with close relatives. Okay, but their phenotypic features, I would say most of them are due to eco-glacial adaptations. I prefer looking to groups such as naledi, such as floresiensis, and erectus, where, like you're saying, yes, there's uniformity in those features. And I am arguing that uniformity is because those features drifted to fixation.
Right,
So of
but
course they're all going to have the features.
you would think there would be some specimens before all these features were fixed in the population that show, wait a minute, this one has some abnormal skeletal features that the other ones don't have.
Repeat that if you don't mind, Jackson. I'm just sending the
Okay.
link to pseudonym because he's not making any sense in the chat.
Let me rethink about what I said. My short-term memory is very bad. Something about, we were talking about Neanderthals. Something about, wouldn't you think we would have some bones before all these features were fixed in the population, and that show some some variation in the skeletal structure?
If I understand what you're saying correctly, my answer is yes, and I believe we do find that. For example, with the work I'm currently doing, I think that, I'm just trying to find some slides on it. I think that Noah and Noah's family would have been closer to probably the Homo heidelbergensis phenotype, because Homo heidelbergensis seems to be the early stage of a lot of these hominins. They were robust. Their bones were quite massive at times. I watched a video of Lee Berger. He was holding up this massive femur, if I remember correctly, and a little tongue in cheek, but he was pointing out, like, we had some gigantic hominins existing. And I think he attributed it to heidelbergensis. And if you look it up, there seems to be a lot of data suggesting that Homo heidelbergensis, existed at 7 feet tall, some of them. And so Neanderthal that we see in terms of their genetics, the ones that are highly inbred with a high genetic load, they appear to be the end stage Neanderthal. And so the early stage could have been closer to heidelbergensis, maybe the early stage erectus, same thing, closer to heidelbergensis, a more healthy phenotype. By healthy phenotype, I just mean a phenotype that's not riddled with evidence for pathology and degeneration.
Well, I mean, we're kind of back to a similar problem, because heidelbergensis all kind of has consistent skeletal features within the species also.
Right, and that's what we'd expect, because post-flood you have this bottleneck where you have Noah, his wife, okay, and then their 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and then their 3 wives. And so from there, you're going to have rapid and exponential population growth where those features that Noah had will be found in descendants. Now, eventually you have subgroups that break off, right? They migrate, they become isolated on islands, for example. I like the way Chris Stringer explains it. He says, the experiment in human evolution conducted on Flores could have been repeated on many of the other islands in the region. that speculation has seemingly been confirmed on the island of Luzon. And so basically what we have in the past with these hominins is we have very rare, very atypical evolutionary, I would call them reductive evolutionary experiments going on that we don't see today. I mean, we have these harsh environmental conditions. We have just a few individuals founding a greater population, basically, where you've got intense inbreeding, intense founder effects, combined with extremely harsh environmental conditions. And the result is, as Chris Stringer says, the result of these experiments are hominins like naledi, very atypical, like floresiensis, where reductive evolution has basically resulted in the small brain sizes we see, the degenerative features like the curved fingers. Is what I'm saying making sense at all? If you have an objection, go ahead.
I mean, I follow what you're saying, yeah.
So, yeah, the point is, it's not like, well, okay, we have, so for example, here's Chris Stringer again, right? These are quotes from evolutionary paleoanthropologists. Notice what he says. Others, such as me, wonder whether the Luzon finds might eventually turn out to be a variant of the already known Homo floresiensis. That's what I say, is these various isolated populations look the way they do because of the conditions they're associated with. Notice what he says here. We know that island isolation can be a catalyst for some odd evolutionary changes, including, and notice this is fascinating, reversions to apparently primitive states. So he's saying reversions to primitive states as in like more Australopith-like, right? More primitive as in pre-human. But I would argue that should actually be reversions to apparently more degenerative states, or states that maybe didn't even exist before floresiensis, before naledi, because you're having healthy morphology, basically take a femur or brain size, and due to the conditions, due to reductive evolution, adaptive selection, you're going from a bigger brain to a smaller brain. You're going from a bigger body size to a smaller body size. You know, you're going from straighter phalanges to more curved phalanges. He calls that primitive states, but he is saying that these isolated conditions that we see the hominins associated with, they're a catalyst for some really interesting changes or adaptive episodes. And but the thing is, Jackson, those would become fixed. So what you're saying is a great question, and that's why I disagree with certain creationists that say, well, these features are because of arthritis or hypothyroidism or this disease or that disease. But if that were the case, not every single individual, including the kids, would have those atypical features. No, but if through founder effects, genetic drift, and fixation, which occurs in small populations, then yes, every single one of those features would drift to fixation, and therefore those features are now the norm of that population. So if you find an individual that is categorized as Homo floresiensis, they're going to have that same set of traits. Go ahead, speak to that a bit, Jackman.
Yeah, I don't really know much about floresiensis, but I mean, I spend my time mostly on the Australopiths and stuff like that.
Well, Jackson, you've been doing a lot on your channel. You've been doing a lot of work. Okay. I drank a lot of coconut water before I started. So why don't you just for a minute, tell the audience what you're up to at your channel. Also what you have planned for the future, including any upcoming debates, anything like that. I'll be back in less than a minute and we'll continue this conversation. Jackson, go ahead.
All right. Okay. He has to go to the bathroom, so I'll take over. I noticed someone mentioned I have a snake in my picture. That's not because of some Bible reference that I'm like mocking the, Genesis or something. That was my pet snake. That was my green mamba. The government got pretty mad at me about that. I don't have it anymore, so that's what that's about. Anyway, I've been talking a lot about genetic entropy and like mostly carbon-14 lately, transitional fossils, stuff like that on my channel. That's pretty much all I've been doing. I'm going to be carbon dating some. Oh yeah, I do like exotic pets. I'm going to be carbon dating some samples actually here pretty soon as an experiment. So that'll be interesting to see what comes of it. Kind of as an answer to the rate experiments. I'll talk more about that when it comes out. There were salamanders, bubblegum, not lizards. And I saved them from being eaten. Does anyone have any questions for me about all this stuff? Like, are you guys familiar with the Littlefoot fossil? I know Donnie is, but like you guys in the audience? Because like most creationist outlets don't seem to cover it much.
Jackson, I'm really looking forward to if, we schedule the Robertson Genis.
Oh yeah, I got the slideshow already made up. Pretty much.
Geocentrism debate. I think that'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So my question is, aside from your Australopithecines, okay, Dr. Peter Line and I, we are going, and hopefully you'll be there in the live chat, Jackson, to ask questions and raise some objections and challenges. The hominids, those in the human line, although you'd have the Australopithecines in the human line too, but the Homo genus, right? Floresiensis, naledi, heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, those that we would both agree are more human. You might say primitive human or pre-human. Nonetheless, those features, if they were to drift to fixation, as we understand is the case in instances where we have a group that exists in a small population, they're inbreeding, and the environmental conditions associated with that population are harsh, right? Think about it. Neanderthals lived in the cold, ecoglacial environments. They were highly inbred, existed in really, really small populations. Floresiensis was stuck on an island, highly inbred. They find elephants on that island that are dwarfed as well. Okay, so environment dictates phenotype and morphology. Luzonensis, same thing. Naledi found 15 individuals within a cave. Okay, so all of these examples would tell us that, okay, these atypical features have become fixed. And that's how me as a creationist would explain it. That's the model that I hold to, right? Post-Babel dispersal, many different groups migrate to less than ideal parts of the world, islands, just horrible environmental situations they exist in. And what happens is we get evidence for degeneration pathology. Does that make sense, Jackson? Do you see any major problems with that at all?
I mean, no, the way you're describing it, I mean, that I still think they're different species in humans, but basically you're right about the founder effect.
Right, because I mean, that's how founder effects work. Again, Chris Stringer, he's pointing out that, and Grayson, that's a good question. That's a very good question. That's because, as Chris Stringer says, the experiments that took place on these islands, that took place with these isolated individuals, those have not necessarily been recapitulated today. Those were some very anomalous conditions. The cold ecoglacial environments of the Ice Age, these islands where we have a small group existing for generation after generation after generation. And so these phenotypes drift to what we see today in the fossil record, but have those same evolutionary experiments, as Chris Stringer says, have they been mimicked or have they been recapitulated today in the modern world? No, I don't believe so. We're not existing in the same harsh environmental conditions that these hominins did, nor are we experiencing the kind of isolation and inbreeding that those hominins did.
What about the North Sentinelese? They're stuck on an island and they look pretty much human. I mean, they are human. They look human.
Well, it's going to come down to how many generations are they stuck on that island, the environmental conditions associated with their isolation, with their inbreeding. And so I'm going with what Chris Stringer says, that yes, these kinds of isolated conditions, these types of anomalous situations are a catalyst for some very interesting evolutionary changes. And then those changes, they become fixed where everybody has it. So it's not like, well, this one individual has arthritis and then coincidentally everybody else got arthritis. No, it's those features are the norm within that population.
So, Donnie, we have a pretty big sample size of populations being isolated to islands. Like Jackson brought up the North Sentinelese, which have certainly been there for very many generations, but there's all Micronesia, Polynesia, all throughout the oceans. We have like a sample size that's very, very large of isolated island populations, and none of them have become anything like Homo floresiensis or Homo naledi, or like they're all still anatomically human. None of them look anything like these other, what you're saying are pathological, like Homo erectus. None of them skeletally, they all look Homo sapien. And just one other point, like when you talk about Homo erectus or Neanderthal, those were not isolated populations at all. We find Neanderthal and Homo erectus spread over multiple continents.
Appreciate those points. Grayson, welcome to the show. I'm glad that you're here because I was, my next topic that I was going to go into is the unconstrained sequences and the hierarchies they fall out into. And so it's good to have you here because you'll be able to engage that. To respond to, firstly, for the audience, I'm pumped for your debate with CJ Cox coming up on Exodus. So you're going to be an Exodusologist soon with all the study you're doing, reading the book of Exodus. So I'm impressed. Okay, so in response to what you're saying, we'll start backwards. Neanderthals and erectus, they existed in small tribes, but I agree with you, they were widespread. Neanderthal existing all throughout Eurasia. But each group of Neanderthal existed as a small tribe, maybe somewhere between 50 and 200 individuals. Okay, just kind of throwing a number out there, but definitely a few individuals. And that's exactly why their genetics, and I'd predict if we got the genetics of erectus, we'd find the same thing where you have just these.
That's not how that works, Donnie. You need to calculate the effective population. You don't just look at like how big their closest kin group is, because that's not how mating patterns work. You have to calculate the effective population size. It's a calculated value. It's not just based on how big the average number of people that they hung out with is.
I agree with you that we need to calculate the effective population size, but I don't believe considering that helps your case or refutes anything I'm saying. What do you believe the effective population size for, let's say, erectus was, or even Neanderthals?
I've got no clue. I wouldn't be comfortable offering a guess, but we could certainly look it up and see if it has been calculated.
Look it up. And I would argue that whatever it is calculated as is probably a strong guess, strongly inferred, because yes, we find bones of these individuals, but we only find a few, like Naledi, we find 15 individuals, right? Well, how many individuals in total? What was the effective population size of Naledi? I mean, I think you're just guessing basically. But my point is so let's say effective population size, Neanderthals, 30,000 across Eurasia.
That's
okay.
probably pretty high even.
Okay. Well, then basically that best case scenario, 30,000, even less, say 15,000. Okay. Very small population, but that population would be broken up into tribes of, again, between 50 and let's say 100. But it's not like this tribe intermingles with this tribe and this tribe intermingles with this tribe. No, they're existing in their tribes and they're breeding, they're mating within those tribes for long periods of time.
That's not how that works. Like, and
that's
in
exactly
the actual equations, none of what you just said is even relevant. Like the effective population size, it's what's important. for calculating inbreeding effects. So
We
none of the kinship group size even is a factor. And it is the case that the different tribes mingle around. Look at any hunter-gatherers or like bands of any primates, and that is the behavior that's always observed. Like, I mean, like the females or the males will go out to a different tribe, and you do have intertribal mingling. Like that's been the case throughout all of human history, and we have the genetics to back that up.
Well, you're
Like, you can calculate.
Well, you're inferring that that's the case all throughout human history. These
But you can
Neanderthals.
calculate
Wait. Listen. Dude. The Neanderthals existed in conditions that are totally different to conditions we live in today. The cold ecoglacial conditions they existed in, the highly inbred nature of them, and then existing like that for generations and generations and generations. Okay, whatever inbreeding effects take place, those will be manifested outwardly, and eventually they're going to drift to fixation. Again, I was telling Jackson earlier that Neanderthals, I don't think are the best example, because I think a lot of their phenotype, at least, is the result of cold ecoglacial adaptations. But somebody like, a group like floresiensis or naledi, yes, I would argue that isolation, inbreeding, and founder effects is what explains their atypical features.
Here's something else about inbreeding. It's kind of brings out recessive traits kind of randomly. It seems like with axolotls, look at those. You got leucistic ones, melanistic ones, albino ones. I mean, they don't really look skeletally. They look consistent, but I mean, you see what I'm saying?